Hi everyone, my name is Chewy Wang and today is the first lesson of the book club for Year 5 and Year 6. So we're going to start reading our first book today and I'll be taking you through lessons for the rest of the term. Now, the first novel that we're going to read is called The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. The Catcher in the Rye is an absolute classic novel. It's considered one of the most famous novels of all time, and for good reason. There's lots of really great discussion and interesting discussion in there of all sorts of issues. Now, how we're going to run this book is we're going to read it across 4 weeks. And across these 4 weeks, I'm going to upload 5 different videos. This first video is going to be about context. So context is the information that's surrounding the actual novel. So what history did the writer have? What background did he have? What period of time was he writing it in, etc. The next 3 videos are going to be me taking out different sections and quotes of the book, breaking them down and analyzing them for you and with you. And finally, the last part is going to be about what I think J.D. Salinger's overall message is. What is his overall argument? We're going to do a summary episode where I sum up all the analysis that we've done over the course of the previous 4 videos. So overall, there's going to be in 5 parts. This first part, once again, is about context. So let's talk quickly for the next 10 minutes or so about The Catcher in the Rye and its context. So, The Catcher in the Rye is a couple of things, and I want you to note this down if you can. The 2 main, most important elements in The Catcher in the Rye are 1, it's a coming-of-age novel, and 2, it's a post-war novel. These are both incredibly important elements that shape what The Catcher in the Rye ultimately ends up being. Let's talk first about the idea of the coming of age. So the coming of age is a genre that's been explored. It's a type of book. It's kind of a genre, not really, but it's like basically like a plot structure that's been done in lots of other television shows and films and novels in the past. But arguably, The Catcher in the Rye is the most famous example of a coming of age novel. What does coming of age mean? It basically means it's a novel about a teenager who is in his adolescence, growing up and learning how to be an adult. And maybe that means they're maturing in terms of emotions, maybe that means they're actually physically maturing, or maybe it just means they're growing up because they're seeing the world and they're experiencing the world and they have all these new opinions, thoughts, and perspectives. That is what a coming of age novel is. And this, Catcher in the Rye, is fundamentally about a teenager growing up. That's what J.D. Salinger wants to convey, the experience of anxiety, of angst, of worry, of all these sorts of elements, all these feelings that a teenager might feel as he prepares to leave high school and grow up and have responsibilities and become an adult. Now, why was this so compelling? Well, J.D. Salinger was one of the first in the world to ever portray teenagers as a sort of unique population, because there was never really any novels before that focused on this kind of awkward transitionary stage between childhood and adulthood. There were always books about children, obviously, and most of the novels out there were about adults, but The Catcher in the Rye focused solely on that weird period between childhood and adulthood, the awkward years of the teenager. Now, that's only one of the that's kind of like a surface level analysis of the novel, right? That it's a coming of age novel. What's more interesting is how it links to J.D. Salinger's outside context. So it's really important to note that The Catcher in the Rye was written very, very soon after World War II. And J.D. Salinger actually wrote it during the war and kept editing it and published it just after the war ended. And that's actually a really important piece of context because it informs a lot of the themes of the novel. So when I say themes, I just mean like main ideas, what J.D. Salinger is mainly talking about and the stuff that informs a lot of what Holden Caulfield, the main character, does. So what does the war have to do with a novel about a kid, getting out, like escaping school and messing about in New York City? That doesn't seem to be like a very relevant thing, right? Well, let me explain it for you. Basically, World War II was a disastrous war for a lot of people, but especially the United States. World War II was arguably the most disastrous event that's ever happened in history because of not only there was a high death count as comparable to that of World War I, but also because there were lots of atrocities committed in World War II that definitely shocked people, right? Things like the Holocaust, things like America dropping the bomb on Japan. All these events definitely influence people and cause them to have great anxiety. And what this anxiety meant was a couple of things. 1, people really definitely worried all the time about their own safety and their own existence. Why? Because in a world where the bomb has been dropped, the nuclear bomb on Hiroshima that killed hundreds of thousands of people, in a world where hundreds and thousands of deaths can happen, in the click of a finger, in the push of a button, that's a very scary world to live in. And lots of people were definitely worried about how they were going to, find meaning and sort of preserve their sanity in a world where mass scale death can just happen like that. And obviously there was a great sort of flow of tension all throughout society. Another thing to know is because of the war and the way that it panned out and how horrific it was, lots of people began to distrust institutions and authority. And this is something that appears in a lot of post-war novels, but especially in The Catcher in the Rye. Why? Because obviously, if you're living under a government that does all these horrific things, how can you trust the government? And by extension, how can you trust the people that are actually in power and controlling people and telling them how to live? In this case, the institution that our main character, Holden Caulfield, is revolting against seems to be a simple one, seems to be a relatively harmless one compared to the government, and that is, of course, the high school environment. Holden Caulfield spends his entire novel revolting against the idea of grown-ups, of adults, of people who occupy positions of power. His parents, his home, like gangsters on the street, all sorts of different groups of adulthood that he just fundamentally rejects because he finds them not trustworthy, he finds them dishonest, he finds them evil, he finds them manipulative. Now, obviously you could read it at a surface level and say, okay, this is actually about a kid who just really hates, following the rules, and just treat it as a funny story where a kid runs around New York messing around for a bit. But I think that's a very, very, aesthetic level of appreciation. That's only a surface level appreciation. When we look deeper, we see these anxieties that Holden Caulfield has. They're actually very reflective of the regular American person after the war and how they distrusted their authorities. So basically what I'm trying to say is that J.D. Salinger is using this coming-of-age novel, this format about a child who rebels against his school and his parents, as a symbol, as a metaphor, as a reflection of how people really felt back in the day in terms of World War II attitudes and in terms of how they treated authority. So he's taking the anxieties of the common man, the common American man and woman, and putting them into the brain of a teenager and showing, how would that manifest in a person like that. Now, what's interesting is this novel is really based on J.D. Salinger's own experience. So J.D. Salinger went to military school. He was writing this during World War II, and he was trying to channel a lot of the anger and the war, the anxiety and the tension surrounding the war into this character of Holden Caulfield. So as you'll come to see, Holden Caulfield is a very angsty boy. Okay, he constantly worries, he constantly complains, and he constantly tries to revolt against any sort of person who might control him. But it's really important to see how he changes over time. And of course, that's what a coming-of-age novel is. If you know you're getting into a coming-of-age novel, then you kind of already spoiled the novel for yourself, right? Like, you know that the character is going to start somewhere that's immature and end up somewhere that's mature. But the whole novel is about how he makes that process, how he comes to become mature after being so immature. So it's really important to note, while you're reading the novel, how he changes over time. How does his language change, his diction? How does his attitudes towards other people, adults and other children like change? And more significantly, what is the ending meant to tell us? Now, obviously that's very, very far ahead, but it's just a couple of questions to think about as you read the novel. So that concludes the first brief video of the book club. I have one task for you. So basically how we're going to run answering questions and homework in this class is I'm going to upload this to YouTube in one big video, one big chunk that you can watch. And basically at the end of every video, I'm going to be asking a question to everyone. Now I want you to comment an answer to the question at the comment section of YouTube, and then I can reply to you as soon as possible. Now, hopefully you all have YouTube accounts. I trust that you're all, very, very well used to this technology, so hopefully that should not be too confusing. So the question for today is, how do you think J.D. Salinger uses Holden Caulfield as a protagonist in the post-war environment? So obviously I've already talked a lot about context already, but I need you to do some research, okay? Do some research on what the, more details about this novel and basically answer the question, how do you think J.D. Salinger uses the coming-of-age novel and Holden Caulfield as a protagonist in this sort of post-war environment? Why does he choose to use a child, a teenager, to represent all of these post-war anxieties? I'll talk to you soon.